Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same articulate, documentary-style tone while slightly altering the word order and structure of the sentences. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Deep within America's oldest mountain range, hidden in the isolated hollows, lies a dark truth that few dare to speak. A legacy of bloodlines so entwined they created their own mythology. This is not a tale of supernatural creatures, but something far more real and disturbing, the devastating consequences when families turn inward upon themselves, creating bloodlines so concentrated they birthed legends of the undead. During the harsh winter of 1887, in the remote regions of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, locals began whispering of the blue people who emerged only at dusk, their skin an unnatural shade that seemed to glow in the dying light. These were the Cold Waters, a clan whose isolation in the deeply wooded valleys of Harlan County had led to generations of intermarriage with close relatives. Their unusual appearance sparked fascination and fear among neighboring communities who, lacking scientific understanding, created folklore to explain what they witnessed. The Cold Waters ain't right, recalled Samuel Hatfield, whose journal entries from 1889 provide some of the earliest documentation of the family. Their skin's the color of twilight and they avoid the sun like it burns them. Folks say they've been marrying brother to sister, cousin to cousin for generations now. The young ones are born strange. Some can't speak proper. Others have eyes that don't look human. When they smile, their gums pulled back, showing teeth that seem too sharp. The Appalachian Mountains, with their treacherous terrain and vast wilderness, had long served as a natural barrier, creating pockets of humanity that existed in remarkable isolation. The post-Civil War era found many families retreating further into the hills, away from the industrialization and social changes sweeping the nation. For the Cold Waters, this isolation became a prison of their own making. The Cold Water family presents a most curious medical phenomenon, wrote local physician Dr. Edmund Clark, who documented several cases in the family in his medical journal. Their bluish skin is unlike anything described in current medical literature. Upon examination of several family members, I have noted abnormal heart rhythms, unusual blood consistency, and pronounced sensitivity to sunlight. Most disturbing are the malformations evident in the youngest generation, joint deformities, skull asymmetry, and cognitive impairments that appear to worsen with each successive generation. The family patriarch, Isaiah Coldwater, had established their homestead in 1831 after migrating from Virginia. Historical records indicate Isaiah arrived with his wife Sarah, who was also his first cousin, and their 3 children. As the family grew, opportunities for marriage outside the clan diminished. By the 1850s, the Coldwaters had begun a pattern of first-cousin marriages that would continue for decades. By the 1880s, more disturbing unions were rumored, including relationships between half-siblings. What the mountain communities didn't understand was that the Coldwaters suffered from a rare genetic condition, methemoglobinemia, caused by a recessive gene that reduced the oxygen-carrying capacity of their blood, giving their skin its distinctive blue cast. This condition, combined with other genetic disorders resulting from consanguinity, created the perfect storm of symptoms that aligned eerily with folk descriptions of vampires, sensitivity to sunlight, abnormal appearance, blood disorders, and developmental issues that locals interpreted as unnatural hungers or curses. The Coldwaters' reclusive nature only fueled speculation. They conducted most of their business at dusk or after nightfall, avoiding the sun that caused painful rashes on their sensitive skin. Their preference for rare meat, recommended by a traveling doctor to address their constant fatigue and weakness, was misconstrued as a bloodthirst. Their tendency to marry young and exclusively within their own family created whispers of unnatural relations and corrupted blood. They keep to themselves, and that's for the best, said local shopkeeper Eliza Thompson in an 1891 account. I only see the Coldwater men after sunset, coming to trade for supplies. They're polite enough, but there's something in their eyes, a wildness like animals. And their children. Lord have mercy on those poor souls. Some born with twisted limbs, others who never learn to speak right. That's what happens when blood gets too close, my grandmother would say. Nature finds a way to punish what ain't natural. The truth behind the Coldwater family's condition wouldn't be understood until decades later. In their time, they were simply viewed as victims of their own corrupt bloodline, living examples of what happens when families violate natural law. The isolation that initially protected them ultimately became their prison, as each generation grew more physically compromised than the last. By 1892, the Coldwater homestead housed for generations ancient Isaiah, now in his 80s, his children and their spouses, most of whom were cousins, their children, many married to their own first cousins, and a fourth generation that bore the most severe manifestations of their genetic inheritance. It was this fourth generation that would become the focus of medical investigation and local horror: children with severe deformities, mental impairments, and, in some cases, violent behavioral issues that the family struggled to contain. The story of the Coldwaters represents just one chapter in the hidden history of consanguinity in the Appalachian Mountains, a practice born not of depravity, but of isolation, ignorance, and necessity. Yet their legacy would spawn a uniquely American vampire myth, one grounded not in supernatural evil, but in the all-too-human tragedy of bloodlines turned inward upon themselves. Check if you're subscribed to this channel, because missing these real historical accounts of America's most isolated families will leave you forever wondering what dark secrets still hide in the mountains of Appalachia today. The Coldwater family's isolation in the Appalachian wilderness had created a perfect storm of genetic concentration. By 1890, within their secluded compound of rough-hewn cabins connected by dirt paths, over 40 family members lived in what amounted to a small, self-contained village. The oldest generation, Isaiah, and his few surviving siblings and cousins, presided over a community where nearly everyone shared not just one common ancestor, but multiple overlapping bloodlines. A disturbing pattern of marriages is revealed by historical records from the Harlan County Courthouse. Between 1840 and 1890, 23 marriage licenses were issued to Coldwater family members. Of these, 17 were between first cousins, 4 between second cousins, and 2 between uncle and niece, relationships that were technically legal but strongly discouraged even in that era. What the records couldn't show were the unofficial unions that locals whispered about, half-siblings who produced children together and other relationships too close to acknowledge publicly. Dr. Clark's medical journal provided clinical observations of what happens when genetic material becomes too concentrated within a family. The Coldwater infants present a catalogue of abnormalities that cannot be coincidental. Of the 12 births I have attended in this family over the past decade, 9 children exhibited significant physical or mental defects. 3 did not survive their first year. Those who live bear the unmistakable marks of their heritage, not just the distinctive blue skin, but malformed limbs, misshapen skulls, and eyes set too wide or too close. Their blood itself appears abnormal under microscopic examination, the corpuscles misshapen and functioning poorly. What Dr. Clark was documenting, though he lacked the scientific terminology, were the effects of recessive genetic disorders that flourish when close relatives reproduce. The Coldwater's methemoglobinia, their blue skin, was just the most visible of their genetic burdens. Others included hemophilia, which caused uncontrollable bleeding from minor injuries, porphyria, which created extreme sensitivity to sunlight and could lead to hallucinations, and various developmental disorders that affected cognition, behavior, and physical development. Isaiah Coldwater, the patriarch, had established family rules that kept them separate from the surrounding communities. "We keep to our own," he reportedly told his children and grandchildren. "Outsiders don't understand our ways. They fear what's different. Our blood is special. It needs to stay pure." This notion of pure blood became a cornerstone of Coldwater family identity, even as it led to their physical deterioration. By 1893, the consequences of this ideology had become impossible to ignore. The youngest generation of Coldwaters included children who couldn't walk until age 5 or 6, who never developed speech beyond primitive vocalizations, and who exhibited violent outbursts that family members struggled to control. Most disturbing to outside observers were the physical changes that seemed to intensify with each generation: elongated canine teeth, actually a dental condition called hypodontia, sensitivity to light that forced some family members to live in near darkness, and dietary restrictions that led to rumors of strange appetites. The youngest Coldwater boy, can't rightly recall his name, came into my store last fall with his father, reported shopkeeper Thomas Wilson. Couldn't have been more than 12, but there was something old in his face. His skin wasn't just blue like the others, it was near translucent, like you could see the veins working underneath. His eyes wouldn't settle, darting around like an animal's. When I handed him a peppermint stick, his hand shook so bad he dropped it. His father apologized, said the boy had the family weakness in his joints. But it wasn't just weakness. I saw it was something broken in how he was made. The family's diet became another source of local speculation. Due to their chronic anemia, another consequence of their genetic disorders, cold water family members craved iron-rich foods. They consumed large quantities of organ meats, particularly liver, and drank tonics containing beef blood prescribed by Dr. Clark to address their weakness. To outside observers, their dietary preferences seemed grotesque and unnatural. They buy more liver and heart than anyone ought to eat, said local butcher James Harmon. Isaiah's eldest boy, Ephraim, comes in twice weekly for 5 or 6 pounds of raw liver. Says they barely cook it, just warm it through. That ain't natural eating. When I suggested he'd try regular cuts of meat, he just smiled with those strange teeth of his and said, "Only blood builds blood, Mr. Harmon." Gave me a chill right down my spine, the way he said it. The cold water's nocturnal habits further isolated them from the community. With several family members unable to tolerate sunlight due to porphyria and related conditions, the family conducted most of their business after sunset. Their homes featured unusually small windows covered with heavy curtains, and family members who ventured out during daylight wore wide-brimmed hats, long sleeves, and gloves regardless of the weather. Local children created rhymes warning about the family: blue face, sharp tooth, cold water's coming after youth. Hide away before the night, or you'll never see the light. Such playground verses reflected the community's growing unease with the family in their midst, an unease that would eventually erupt into open hostility. The neighboring town of Pineville held a community meeting in August 1894 to discuss the cold water situation, as it was delicately termed. The meeting minutes, preserved in the County Historical Society, reveal the depth of local concerns. Reverend Miller raised the question of whether Christian charity requires intervention in the cold water family situation, given reports of children born with grievous deformities and kept hidden from public view. Dr. Clark advised that their condition stems from too close bloodlines rather than moral failings, but acknowledged the practice violates natural law. Sheriff Wilson noted no laws have been broken that would warrant official action, though he expressed personal disgust at their marriage practices. The meeting concluded with no formal action, but unofficial social sanctions intensified. Local businesses began refusing to serve cold water family members. Children were warned away from the family's property. When 3 livestock were found dead on neighboring farms with what appeared to be puncture wounds to their necks, likely the work of wild predators, rumors immediately implicated the cold waters. The family's response was to withdraw further, becoming almost entirely self-sufficient on their mountain property. They grew their own crops, raised livestock, and ventured into town only when absolutely necessary. This increased isolation, however, only worsened their genetic predicament, as younger family members had even fewer options for marriage outside the immediate family. By 1895, the situation reached a breaking point when Ephraim Coldwater's youngest daughter, Ruth, born of his union with his first cousin, died at age 9. Dr. Clark's notes describe a child who never developed beyond the intellectual capacity of a toddler, suffered chronic seizures, and required constant care. Her skin exhibited not the usual bluish tint, but an almost transparent quality, revealing a network of veins that appeared black rather than blue. Her death came after a particularly violent seizure that resulted in uncontrollable bleeding from her nose and mouth, a symptom consistent with the family's blood disorder. Ruth's death marked a turning point for the Coldwater family. Isaiah, now approaching his 90s and reportedly showing signs of dementia, became convinced that the family's blood was not purifying as he had believed, but weakening. He began to seek outside marriages for his youngest grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a desperate attempt to introduce new genetic material into the failing bloodline. But decades of rumors, isolation, and visible evidence of genetic decline made finding willing marriage partners nearly impossible. The Coldwaters had become pariahs, the living embodiment of the consequences of violating natural laws as understood in the 19th century. Their tragedy was not supernatural, but entirely human, a cautionary tale of isolation, ignorance, and the devastating price of turning inward rather than outward for human connection. By the turn of the century, the Coldwater family's situation had deteriorated dramatically. The generation born between 1880 and 1900, the fifth generation since Isaiah's original settlement, bore the most severe consequences of the family's genetic isolation. Medical records from Dr. Clark and his successor, Dr. William Townsend, documented a horrifying catalogue of conditions: infants born with severe cranial deformities, children who never learned to walk or speak, and adolescents who developed seizure disorders, paranoid delusions, and unstable behavior. The youngest generation of Coldwaters presents the most severe manifestations of consanguinity I have encountered in medical literature, wrote Dr. Townsend in 1902. Their conditions go beyond the distinctive blue skin that marked earlier generations. These children exhibit profound physical and neurological abnormalities. Most disturbing is the case of young Silas Coldwater, age 13, who has developed an extreme sensitivity to light that confines him to darkened rooms, severe dental abnormalities including hypertrophic canine teeth, and a blood disorder requiring weekly transfusions from his siblings. His cognitive function remains intact, making him painfully aware of his condition. Silas Coldwater became the subject of particular fascination and horror in local accounts. Born to parents who were first cousins once removed, his father was the son of Ephraim Coldwater, and his mother was Ephraim's cousin's daughter. Silas exhibited the family's blue skin condition in its most extreme form. His skin was so translucent that the blood vessels beneath were clearly visible, giving him a marbled appearance. His sensitivity to sunlight was so severe that exposure for more than a few minutes caused blistering burns. Most distinctive were his dental abnormalities, canine teeth that grew unusually long and sharp, forcing his lips to remain partially open. This, combined with his extremely pale complexion and the dark circles that permanently surrounded his sensitive eyes, gave him an appearance that local residents found deeply unsettling. When blood transfusions from his healthier siblings became necessary to treat his severe anemia, rumors spread that Silas was drinking the blood of his own kin to survive. In reality, these transfusions were crude but medically appropriate procedures performed by Dr. Townsend. The doctor would draw blood from Silas's brother, Jeremiah, who showed fewer symptoms of the family's genetic conditions, and administer it directly to Silas using newly developed transfusion techniques. These procedures temporarily alleviated Silas's weakness, pallor, and mental confusion, symptoms of his severe anemia. The town's perception of these treatments, however, filtered through superstition and fear. "They're bleeding the healthy ones to feed the cursed ones," claimed local midwife Martha Collins. "That ain't medicine. That's against God and nature both. Dr. Townsend says it's to help the boy, but you can't fight what's in bad blood with more of the same blood." What do you think about families like the Coldwaters? Have you ever wondered how isolated communities develop such unique genetic conditions? Leave a comment saying, "Blood doesn't lie," if you believe science can explain what our ancestors called curses. The most severe consequences of the Coldwaters' genetic decline appeared in their youngest members. Between 1900 and 1905, 16 children were born into the extended family. Of these, records indicate that 5 were stillborn or died shortly after birth with severe congenital abnormalities. Of the 11 who survived infancy, 7 developed significant health issues in childhood, including the blood disorders characteristic of the family, developmental delays, skeletal deformities, and neurological conditions. Jeremiah Coldwater, at 16, was considered one of the healthier family members of his generation, though he still exhibited the family's blue skin tone and suffered from milder forms of their various conditions. As Silas's primary blood donor and closest sibling, Jeremiah became his brother's caretaker and protector. Local accounts describe Jeremiah as unusually strong and physically imposing despite the family's typically slender build, a genetic anomaly that worked in his favor. Jeremiah may have a Coldwater look about him, but there's nothing weak in how he's made, observed local logger Thomas Jenkins. Saw him lift a fallen tree limb that would take 2 grown men normally. His protective of that sickly brother of his. Came into town after dark to fetch the doctor when the boy took bad. Carrying a lantern that he kept shielded, like even that much light might hurt his eyes. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's no meanness in him like some say. Just sadness, like he knows what his family's become. Jeremiah's relative health made him an object of hope for the family elders, who had finally recognized the need for outside marriages. In 1905, an arrangement was made between Isaiah Coldwater, now in his final years, and a struggling family in a neighboring county. Their daughter, Mary Simmons, aged 15, would marry Jeremiah, bringing fresh genetic material into the declining bloodline. In exchange, the Simmons family received a significant parcel of Coldwater land, a desperate transaction that revealed the family's growing awareness of their dire situation. The marriage took place in October 1905, performed by a traveling preacher who knew nothing of the Coldwaters' reputation. Mary came to live on the family compound, becoming the first outsider to observe their daily life in decades. Her letters to her sister, preserved in county historical records, provide a rare glimpse into the family's private existence. "The stories don't capture the sadness of this place," Mary wrote 3 months after her marriage. "Jeremiah is kind to me and stronger than any man I've known, despite his unusual appearance. His skin truly is blue, though in certain light it looks more gray than anything. His younger brother, Silas, stays in rooms kept dark with heavy curtains. I've only glimpsed him a few times. He has the look of someone already dead, with eyes that seem too large and skin so pale you can see every vein. They perform a procedure twice monthly where the doctor draws blood from Jeremiah and gives it to Silas. Jeremiah says it keeps his brother alive, though it leaves him weak for days after. The older Coldwaters watch me constantly, especially when I'm near the youngest children. 3 little ones have never spoken a word despite being old enough to talk. Another, a girl of about 7, walks in a strange shuffling way with her head tilted always to the left. They keep certain rooms locked at all times. Jeremiah says those rooms contain family members too affected by the condition to be seen. I hear sounds from behind those doors, sometimes not quite human sounds. Jeremiah promises me our children won't be like that. That my outside blood will strengthen the family. I pray he's right, though I've yet to conceive despite being married nearly a year now." Mary's integration into the Coldwater family was not smooth. Older family members, particularly those most devoted to Isaiah's belief in blood purity, regarded her with suspicion and resentment. Younger members, especially those suffering from the family's conditions, viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and desperate hope. She represented a possible escape from their genetic fate. Silas, in particular, developed a complex relationship with his new sister-in-law. As his condition worsened, requiring more frequent blood transfusions from Jeremiah, he became resentful of Mary's claim on his brother's time and attention. Mary's letters describe increasingly disturbing interactions. "Silas watches me when he thinks I don't notice. Can only emerge from his rooms after sunset, and even then wears a wide hat and scarf that covers most of his face. Last night I found him standing outside our cabin, just staring at the window. When I opened the door to ask what he wanted, he said, 'I can hear your heart beating from here. Strong, healthy blood.' Jeremiah says his brother doesn't mean to frighten me, that his condition affects his mind sometimes, but I've taken to securing the doors and windows at night." The tensions within the family compound escalated in the winter of 1906 to 1907, one of the harshest on record in Appalachian history. Heavy snowfall cut off the already isolated Coldwater property from the nearest town for nearly 3 months. Food supplies dwindled, and medical care became impossible to access as Dr. Townsend could not reach the family. For Silas and the other severely affected family members, this meant no professional medical treatment for their various conditions. In desperation, the family turned to folk remedies and increasingly extreme measures to address their medical needs. Jeremiah continued to provide blood for his brother, but without the doctor's supervision, the procedures became dangerous. Mary's final letter, dated February 18, 1907, reveals the family's desperate situation. The winter shows no sign of breaking, and supplies grow scarcer each day. The sickest among the family suffer most. Silas has grown so weak he can barely leave his bed, yet his hunger seems to increase. Jeremiah has given so much blood he can hardly stand, and I fear for his health. Last night, I overheard the elder family members discussing whether animal blood might serve instead of human. They slaughtered one of the few remaining pigs and collected its blood in a bowl. Silas refused it violently, throwing it against the wall and screaming that only family blood would sustain him now. The older Coldwaters look at me differently these days, measuring me with their eyes in a way that makes me fear their intentions. They whispered that as an outsider who has brought no children to the family, my blood might be spent to save those of true Coldwater lineage. Jeremiah promises he won't allow them to harm me, but he grows weaker daily. I plan to attempt an escape when the next storm clears, though the snow remains deep, and I know not if I can reach town before freezing or being pursued. No further letters from Mary exist in the historical record. When spring finally came and the snow melted enough for travel, Dr. Townsend made his way to the Coldwater property, concerned about his patients after the long isolation. His journal entry from April 3, 1907, provides the final documented account of the family before subsequent events altered their situation forever. Reached the Coldwater compound today after arduous travel. Found conditions far worse than anticipated. Of the 36 family members I treated before winter, only 27 remain. Multiple deaths occurred during the isolated months, primarily among the eldest and youngest members, though Silas Coldwater also perished despite his brother's sacrifices. Jeremiah appears severely anemic but ambulatory. His wife Mary is nowhere to be found. When questioned, family members claim she abandoned them during a brief thaw in February, though no one in town reports seeing her. The surviving children show signs of severe malnourishment. Most disturbing are the fresh graves behind the main house, too numerous to account for only the reported deaths. The family resisted my attempts to examine these burial sites. I have grave concerns about what transpired here during the winter months, particularly regarding the missing Mary Coldwater. Will report my suspicions to Sheriff Wilson upon return to town, though I expect little action given the family's isolation and the lack of concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The winter of 1906 to 1907 marked the beginning of the end for the Coldwater family as a cohesive unit. What followed would transform their tragic story of genetic decline into something far darker in local memory, a transformation that would permanently link their name with the vampire legends of Appalachia. The spring and summer of 1907 brought a reckoning for the Coldwater family. Dr. Townsend's report to Sheriff Wilson initiated an investigation into Mary Coldwater's disappearance. Though the sheriff's approach was cautious, the Coldwaters had lived in the region for generations and, despite their peculiarities, had generally been law-abiding. Additionally, the sheriff's jurisdiction in the remote mountain hollows was tenuous at best. "I ain't eager to venture onto Coldwater land without good cause," Sheriff Wilson reportedly told Dr. Townsend. "Those folks keep to themselves, and that suited everyone fine for decades. If the girl left of her own accord during the winter, that's between her and her husband. Mountain marriages break sometimes, ain't no crime in that." Nevertheless, pressure from Mary's family, particularly her father, John Simmons, forced the sheriff to make an official inquiry. In late April 1907, Sheriff Wilson and 2 deputies rode to the Coldwater compound. The account of their visit, documented in county records, marked the first official interaction between law enforcement and the reclusive family in decades. The sheriff's report described a community in visible decline. The Coldwater property shows signs of significant neglect. Several cabins appear abandoned with broken windows and collapsed roofing. The main house, where Patriarch Isaiah Coldwater resides, is maintained in better condition. Approximately 24 family members were visible during our visit, many exhibiting the blue-tinged skin condition characteristic of the family, along with various physical deformities and apparent mental limitations. Jeremiah Coldwater received us on the family's behalf, as his grandfather Isaiah is now bedridden. Jeremiah's appearance is striking, tall and powerfully built, but with the family's distinctive coloring and unusually prominent canine teeth. He spoke clearly and intelligently, expressing regret over his wife's departure but claiming no knowledge of her whereabouts after she allegedly left the property during a February thaw, taking a small amount of provisions. He permitted a cursory search of the main buildings but refused access to certain locked rooms, claiming they contained family members too ill to be disturbed. Most concerning were the numerous fresh graves behind the main house, 15 in total, far more than the winter deaths acknowledged by the family. When questioned about these, Jeremiah claimed several contained animal remains, as the harsh winter had killed much of their livestock. His explanation was plausible but not entirely convincing. Without evidence of foul play, however, no grounds exist for further investigation at this time. Sheriff Wilson's reluctance to press the investigation frustrated John Simmons, who became convinced that his daughter had met with foul play. Throughout the summer of 1907, Simmons gathered support among local families, sharing rumors and suspicions about the Coldwater's unusual physical characteristics, their nocturnal habits, and their apparent need for blood transfusions. These discussions, occurring in church meetings and at community gatherings, began to frame the family not simply as victims of excessive inbreeding, but as something more sinister. John Simmons has been spreading wild tales about the Coldwaters, noted local minister Reverend Miller in his personal journal. What began as concern for his daughter has transformed into a campaign of fear. He speaks of them as vampires in human form, citing their blue skin, avoidance of sunlight, and the blood treatments Dr. Townsend administered to the sickly boy Silas. Such superstitious thinking has no place in a God-fearing community. Yet, I find more and more parishioners giving credence to these tales. Even reasonable men now speak of the family in hushed tones, as though they were not unfortunate victims of their isolation, but practitioners of something unholy. The transformation of the Coldwaters from medical curiosities to objects of supernatural fear accelerated in August 1907 when a series of livestock deaths occurred on farms neighboring their property. Several sheep and a cow were found with precise puncture wounds to their necks, drained of blood in a manner that local farmers had never encountered before. While predator attacks were common in the region, these deaths exhibited an unusual precision that locals found deeply unsettling. The timing coincided with renewed activity at the Coldwater compound. After months of relative seclusion following the winter deaths, family members began making more frequent trips into town for supplies. These appearances, always near dusk, featured younger family members who had rarely been seen before, including two adolescent boys who exhibited the family's distinctive appearance but were unfamiliar to local merchants. "The new Coldwater boys give me a chill," reported shopkeeper Wilson in a community meeting documented by the local newspaper. "Blue as the evening sky, with eyes that don't seem right, too bright, too alert. They buy strange combinations of goods. No normal foodstuffs, just salt, alcohol, and butchering supplies." When asked about their family's health after the hard winter, the older one smiled in a way that showed teeth no Christian child should have, saying, "We grow stronger through sacrifice. I want no more of their business in my establishment." By September, community tension had escalated to the point that Sheriff Wilson found himself unable to ignore the situation. A formal petition signed by 23 local families, including several prominent citizens, demanded a more thorough investigation of the Coldwater property, particularly regarding the numerous fresh graves and Mary Coldwater's disappearance. Reluctantly, Sheriff Wilson organized a larger expedition, including Dr. Townsend, John Simmons, and 6 armed deputies. The confrontation that followed on September 23, 1907, would permanently alter local perception of the Coldwater family and generate a vampire legend that persists in regional folklore to the present day. Sheriff Wilson's official report provides a clinical account of the events, though newspaper coverage and oral histories recorded decades later offer more emotional perspectives. "Upon approaching the Coldwater property at midday, our party observed no activity or movement around the buildings," the sheriff wrote. Multiple attempts to summon residents received no response. Under authority of an investigation into Mary Coldwater's disappearance, we proceeded to enter the main house, finding it apparently abandoned despite personal belongings and furniture remaining in place. Evidence suggested a hasty departure, food remained on tables, clothing was strewed about, and doors stood open. The locked rooms Dr. Townsend had previously noted were now accessible. Inside, we discovered conditions that can only be described as deeply disturbing. One room contained hospital-style beds with restraints attached. Another held primitive medical equipment for blood transfusion procedures. Most concerning was a windowless cellar room accessible only through a trap door, containing several wooden boxes lined with soil, not dissimilar to coffins but smaller in size. Dr. Townsend suggests these may have been used to transport severely photosensitive family members, though this explanation strikes me as incomplete. At Mr. Simmons's insistence, we proceeded to examine the numerous graves behind the property. Exhumation of 3 graves revealed troubling findings. The first contained animal remains, as claimed by Jeremiah Coldwater during our previous visit. The second contained the body of an elderly male, presumably Isaiah Coldwater, buried according to normal practices. The third grave, however, revealed the remains of a young female matching Mary Coldwater's description. Dr. Townsend's examination indicated unnatural death. The body showed evidence of significant blood loss through puncture wounds to the neck and wrists. No animal could have created such precise injuries. Most of the family appears to have fled the property, with their current whereabouts unknown. I have dispatched telegrams to neighboring county authorities advising them to watch for the distinctive Coldwater family members. This investigation has now shifted from a missing person case to a potential homicide inquiry. The newspaper account published 3 days later in the Harlan County Register took a far less restrained approach, running under the headline, "Vampire Family Flees Justice, Blood Cult Exposed in Mountain Hollow." The article detailed the blood-drinking practices of the inbred clan, claiming that exhumation had revealed multiple victims with telltale vampire wounds. It cited unnamed sources who claimed the family had practiced ritual consumption of human blood for generations, concealing their activities behind a remote location and the cover story of a genetic condition. The lurid coverage sparked both fear and morbid fascination. Hundreds of curiosity seekers traveled to view the Coldwater property before Sheriff Wilson cordoned it off as a crime scene. Local entrepreneurs quickly capitalized on the sensation, selling authentic vampire soil allegedly taken from the compound and protective amulets guaranteed to ward off the Coldwater curse. John Simmons, grief-stricken by the confirmation of his daughter's death, organized a group of local men determined to hunt down the fled family members. Their search through the mountains continued for weeks but yielded no results. The difficult terrain, with its countless caves, hidden hollows, and abandoned mining tunnels, provided ample hiding places for those familiar with the region. By winter, interest in the case had begun to wane. Sheriff Wilson maintained that his office was pursuing all leads, but with no sightings of Coldwater family members for months, the trail had grown cold. The property stood abandoned, gradually reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Local children dared each other to approach the decaying buildings, claiming that after dark, lights could sometimes be seen moving within the empty structures. Dr. Townsend, the only medical professional with extensive knowledge of the family's true conditions, attempted to provide a rational explanation for the events in a letter to a medical journal in December 1907. The tragic case of the Coldwater family represents not supernatural evil, but the devastating consequences of genetic isolation and medical ignorance. Their distinctive blue skin resulted from methemoglobinemia, a recessive blood disorder that appeared with increasing frequency due to consanguineous marriages. Other conditions, porphyria, various developmental disorders, and hemophilia, similarly intensified through generations of inbreeding. The extreme photosensitivity exhibited by some family members, their need for blood transfusions, and the dental abnormalities that created the appearance of fangs all have medical explanations. Even the soy-lined boxes discovered in their home likely served a practical purpose, providing secure transport for severely photosensitive individuals who could not otherwise travel during daylight hours. Regarding the death of Mary Coldwater, and possibly others, I cannot discount the possibility of desperate medical practices gone awry. The harsh winter of 1906 to 1907, which cut the family off from professional medical care, may have driven them to extreme measures to sustain their most vulnerable members. The history of medicine contains many examples of misguided treatments born of desperation rather than malice. The family's flight following investigation likely stems from fear of persecution rather than consciousness of guilt. Having been objects of suspicion and prejudice for generations due to their appearance and reclusiveness, they would have had little reason to expect fair treatment from authorities, particularly given the sensationalistic accounts now circulating about their nature. Dr. Townsend's rational assessment gained little traction against the more compelling vampire narrative that had captured the public imagination. By 1908, the story of the blue vampires of Harlan County had spread throughout the region, appearing in newspapers as far away as Louisville and Cincinnati. The account grew more fantastic with each retelling, the number of victims multiplied, the family's physical abnormalities became more monstrous, and their alleged blood rituals more elaborate. What began as a tragedy of genetic science had transformed into something much more potent, a distinctly American vampire legend, rooted not in European folklore but in the realities of isolated mountain communities, genetic disorders, and the consequences of consanguinity. The true fate of the surviving Coldwater family members remains one of Appalachia's enduring mysteries. The Coldwater legacy did not end with their disappearance in 1907. Over the decades that followed, their story evolved from local scandal to regional folklore to enduring Appalachian legend. Their abandoned property, left to decay in the wooded hollow, became a place of dark fascination, a physical reminder of the family that had spawned a uniquely American vampire mythology. By the 1920s, most who had known the actual Coldwaters had either died or moved away from the region. The family's true medical conditions were forgotten, replaced by increasingly elaborate supernatural accounts. Prohibition-era moonshiners claimed to use the ruins of the Coldwater compound as a hidden camp, reporting strange noises and shadowy figures that drove them to seek other locations. Local folklore began to incorporate the blue vampires into cautionary tales told to unruly children. The first documented academic interest in the Coldwater case came in 1932 when folklorist Howard W. Odom visited the region while collecting Appalachian stories for the University of North Carolina. His field notes, published in the Journal of American Folklore, provided the first scholarly examination of how the family's legacy had transformed. The legend of the Coldwater vampires represents a fascinating American adaptation of European vampire mythology, shaped by the unique social and geographical conditions of Appalachia. While traditional European vampires are typically aristocratic figures who prey upon peasantry, the Coldwater legend inverts this dynamic. Here, extreme isolation and rural poverty created vampires who were themselves victims of circumstance rather than aristocratic predators. Local accounts consistently emphasize the family's blue skin, sensitivity to sunlight, and alleged blood consumption while downplaying or omitting the medical explanations that once existed for these traits. Most interesting is how the legend incorporates distinctly American themes of corrupted bloodlines, the dangers of isolation, and fear of genetic degeneration. In this sense, the Coldwater vampire represents not old-world superstition transplanted to America, but a new mythological creation addressing uniquely American anxieties. Odom's work brought the Coldwater legend to broader academic attention, though it remained primarily a regional tale until the 1950s when folklorist Ruth and Music included an account in her collection, *The Telltale Lilac Bush and Other West Virginia Ghost Tales star. Music's version, titled The Blue People, softened some of the more lurid aspects of the legend while emphasizing its tragic dimensions. They say the blue people still roam these mountains after dark, looking for family they lost long ago. They don't mean harm, mostly, unless you trespass where their kin are buried. They're sad creatures, cursed by their own blood to live forever apart from normal folk. If you see a blue light moving through the trees on a moonless night, or hear singing that sounds like it comes from underground, that's them, remembering what it was to be human before their blood turned against them. The scientific understanding of the Coldwater's actual conditions advanced significantly in the decades following their disappearance. In 1960, hematologist Madison Corin published a groundbreaking study of another blue-skinned family in the Appalachian region, the Fugates of Troublesome Creek, Kentucky. Corin identified their condition as methemoglobinemia caused by a recessive gene, successfully treating affected family members with methylene blue. His research provided the first comprehensive medical explanation for the condition that had marked the Coldwaters generations earlier. The most remarkable development in the Coldwater story occurred in 1977 when construction workers clearing land for a new highway near the Kentucky-West Virginia border made an astonishing discovery. In a remote cave system, they found evidence of human habitation, crude furnishings, preserved food supplies, and, most significantly, a journal written between 1907 and 1911 by Jeremiah Coldwater. The journal, now preserved in the Appalachian History Museum, provides the only first-person account of what happened to the family after their flight from authorities. Written in surprisingly educated prose, it reveals that Jeremiah had received schooling from Dr. Clark in exchange for allowing medical documentation of the family's conditions. September 25, 1907. We have found shelter in the cave system that grandfather Isaiah showed me as a boy. There are 12 of us remaining, all who could travel quickly enough to escape before the sheriff returned with his men. The youngest and oldest we were forced to leave behind. My heart breaks for them, though I know many were already beyond earthly suffering. Silas is truly gone now, having succumbed to his condition during the winter despite all efforts to sustain him. May he find in death the peace that eluded him in life. The accusations against us are beyond comprehension. We are not monsters who consume blood for unholy purposes, but a family afflicted by conditions we never chose. The transfusions performed by Dr. Townsend were medical treatments, not rituals. Mary's death was a tragedy born of desperation during the winter isolation. Her weakened body could not withstand the blood donation she insisted on making to help the suffering children when I became too weak to continue as the sole donor. She gave her life trying to save those she had come to love, despite their strangeness. The puncture marks they found were from the crude medical instruments we were forced to use without the doctor's guidance. We cannot return to the world that has branded us vampires. Our appearance alone would condemn us regardless of innocence. Those of us with the most severe manifestations of our condition can barely tolerate even the filtered sunlight that reaches into the cave entrance. We will make our home here, away from the judgment and fear of those who cannot understand what we are, not monsters, but humans marked by blood far more literally than most. Subsequent entries documented the family's adaptation to cave life, their increasingly successful hunting and gathering expeditions in the surrounding forest, always conducted at night, and Jeremiah's efforts to educate the younger children. The final entry, dated November 12, 1911, suggests the family's intention to move deeper into the Appalachian wilderness. Winter approaches again, and the caves grow too cold for comfort. We have identified a more remote location, deeper in the mountains toward the south, where abandoned mining structures could provide better shelter. Tonight, we begin our journey, traveling only by darkness. Perhaps in time, when the fury over our family is faded, some of the younger ones, whose appearances are less marked, might rejoin the world of men. For myself, I have come to prefer the honest darkness of the forest to the false light of civilization that so quickly turned against us. We are what we are, made by blood, defined by blood, but not in the way they believed. If future generations call us vampires, so be it. The truth is both simpler and more complex. We are the cold waters, and our story is written in our veins. No further written records of the family have ever been discovered. However, throughout the 20th century, scattered reports emerged from remote areas of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Virginia describing encounters with unusual individuals who moved through the forest at night, avoided direct interaction with locals, and sometimes exhibited bluish skin tones. Most such accounts were dismissed as folklore or imagination, but they contributed to the enduring legend. In 1998, genetic researchers became interested in the Cold Water case as part of broader studies on isolated population genetics in Appalachia. DNA testing of remains from the original family cemetery, which had never been relocated after the property was abandoned, confirmed the presence of the recessive gene for methemoglobinemia, along with markers for several other genetic disorders consistent with long-term consanguinity. More intriguingly, a 2004 study of current populations in counties surrounding the original Cold Water land found a higher-than-average frequency of the methemoglobinemia gene, suggesting that some family members had indeed eventually reintegrated into nearby communities. The Cold Water family represents one of the most dramatic documented cases of genetic isolation and consanguinity in American medical history, stated Dr. Eleanor Richards, the geneticist who led the 2004 study. Their story transformed from medical tragedy to supernatural legend largely because the science to explain their condition didn't exist in their time. What neighbors perceived as monstrous or unnatural, their blue skin, photosensitivity, and need for blood transfusions, were simply the visible manifestations of recessive genetic disorders intensified through generations of inbreeding. Today, descendants carrying Cold Water genetic markers are scattered throughout the region, though none exhibit the extreme symptoms that made their ancestors objects of fear and fascination. The family didn't vanish into myth entirely, their blood continues in the veins of current Appalachian residents, most of whom have no idea they carry the genes that once created vampires in these mountains. The abandoned Cold Water property was finally reclaimed by the county for tax delinquency in 1937, eventually becoming part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. Today, little remains of the original structures, just stone foundations largely obscured by vegetation and the small family cemetery with its weathered markers. Yet, the site continues to attract those fascinated by its dark history. Folklorist Dr. Amanda Collins, who has studied the Cold Water legend for over 20 years, offers this perspective on why their story continues to resonate. The Cold Water vampire legend persists because it speaks to something deeply American: our fascination with isolated communities, our fear of genetic corruption, and our complex relationship with family legacy. Unlike European vampire tales, which often feature aristocratic predators, the Cold Water story presents vampirism as a tragic consequence of isolation and ignorance, a cautionary tale about what happens when families turn too far inward. The blue skin that marked the Cold Waters becomes a powerful visual metaphor in American folklore. These weren't hidden monsters passing as human, but visibly marked outsiders whose difference was literally skin deep. Their tragedy was being visibly other in a society that feared difference, particularly difference that emerged from violation of taboos against consanguinity. Most poignantly, the Cold Waters weren't supernatural creatures, but humans suffering from medical conditions they couldn't understand or control. The transformation of their story from medical case study to vampire legend reveals more about the society that created the legend than about the family themselves. We turned them into monsters because it was easier than confronting the human tragedy of their existence and the societal failings that allowed such genetic isolation to occur. Today, the legend of the blue vampires of Appalachia lives on in regional folklore, occasionally appearing in horror fiction, independent films, and ghost tours of the Appalachian Mountains. The true story of a family trapped by isolation, ignorance, and the unforgiving laws of genetics remains less widely known than the supernatural legend it spawned. Yet, in many ways, the real history of the Cold Waters is more haunting than any vampire tale, a stark reminder of what happens when blood calls too strongly to blood, creating a legacy written in suffering rather than immortality. The mountains keep their secrets well. Somewhere in the deep hollows and forgotten caves of Appalachia, perhaps some echo of the Cold Water family remains, not as supernatural predators, but as the last remnants of a bloodline that turned too far inward and paid the ultimate price for their isolation. Their blue skin, so feared in their lifetime, was simply the visible manifestation of what happens when families become too concentrated, too pure in their bloodlines. Not monsters, but victims of their own legacy, a legacy written not in myth, but in blood. If you've watched this story all the way to the end, you've witnessed one of the most disturbing yet scientifically fascinating cases of consanguinity in American history. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you never miss our investigations into the dark corners of human history. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know who truly appreciates these meticulously researched stories. And if this account of the Appalachian vampires gave you chills, hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates learning about these forgotten chapters of American history. The truth is always more haunting than fiction, especially when it's written in blood.